For 2 decades and counting, 2 words have been synonymous with abject terror. Jessica Chobot. And so have 2 other words, Resident Evil. That's right, the venerable survival horror video game series is getting both a brand new game and a brand new movie this week. So what better way to celebrate than with a spooky walk down memory lane? On today's episode of The Dan Cave, I'm going to tell you some frightening facts about Resident Evil that you didn't already know. Now, Resident Evil might seem like a silly name, and it is, but in Japan the series has a different name. It goes by Biohazard. But why did they rename it from Biohazard to Resident Evil? Well, when Capcom wanted to bring it stateside, they realized they had to rebrand it because the name Biohazard was already taken by both a New York City thrash band and a crappy MS-DOS game. Eventually, though, the marketing team settled on the name Resident Evil after holding a company-wide contest. And even better, it's a pun! You know, because the first game takes place in a mansion, a residence, where the nightmarish creatures attack them, evil things. You guys get it? Resident Evil? Oh, so good. But I'm still bummed they didn't use my suggestion of Dead and Breakfast, which I think is pretty cool. Then you could have like evil waffles like bursting through windows. Wouldn't that be tight? Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine weren't the only player characters originally planned for Resident Evil 1. Now, in addition to the fact that it was going to be a co-op game, I know, they were also going to be joined by a black guy named Geltzer, a medic based on Eddie Murphy who would serve as the comic relief, and Dewey, a weird, beefy cyborg guy who looks like if Bane had a baby with Cable almost. It's weird. Both were ditched fairly early in the development process, and thus Barry and Rebecca were born. But I will say Edward Dewey got his day in the sun eventually as a non-playable STARS pilot in 2003's Resident Evil Outbreak. As for Geltzer, well, I like to think he eventually found a very different haunted mansion.
The key is in the mausoleum.
You left your key.
Now, the voice acting in Resident Evil 1 is notoriously bad, but apparently it was almost worse. I know. Resident Evil was originally going to have an all-Japanese language voice cast, but the game's director Shinji Mikami threw it out after the version they turned in was deemed too terrible to publish. Instead, they decided to hire an English cast to dub it over, and the results, well, let's say they speak for themselves, even though I wish they didn't.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
In fact, the voice acting in Resident Evil was so bad that it won the Guinness World Record for worst game dialogue ever, an award that seems too petty to be part of Guinness but actually exists. And after hearing lines like this, it's not hard to understand why.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
It's widely accepted that Resident Evil is what launched the survival horror genre in video gaming, but the game itself is actually based on another older Capcom title, 1989's Famicom RPG, Sweet Home. You've probably never played it because the game never made it stateside due to its hardcore violence, gore, and explicit content. However, its trappings of having a limited inventory and a gigantic mansion full of murderous monsters with unnecessary door-opening animations between every room would live on in Resident Evil forever. Because what could be scarier than a never-ending series of pixelated doors? The Resident Evil movies have grossed more than $900 million worldwide, and they may have grossed you out if you're not a fan of True Love, you monster. Now, series director Paul W.S. Anderson met and married star Milla Jovovich after working on Resident Evil together. Oh, it's so sweet. However, that almost didn't come to pass because originally George A. Romero was hired to direct, and Gwyneth Paltrow was eyed for the role of Alice. Now, Romero, who is largely accepted to be the grandfather of all zombie fiction in the modern era, was fired because producers didn't like his script. It actually hewed closer to the game than the original movie. Now, Gwyneth Paltrow, on the other hand, passed on the role because she presumably prefers to cause global pandemics like in the movie Contagion rather than stop them. The game series is full of some mysterious herbs, but one is so mysterious it only exists in the code of Resident Evil 0. The way that our intrepid heroes heal their wounds and aid their ailments in Resident Evil is by ingesting some seriously dank kush, or whatever the hell kind of multicolored kale those herbs are actually supposed to be. Now, apparently developers were going to include a pink herb as well in Resident Evil 0, but it never made it to the final game, and I can only assume that by eating it, it'll get you high enough to make the story actually make sense. Now, 2 other classic Capcom games very nearly became entries in the Resident Evil franchise too. Resident Evil 4 was going to be a cool stylized action game with a badass protagonist, but it felt at odds with what director Hideki Kamiya and writer Noboru Sugimura came up with. Instead, they wanted to make this fast-paced supernatural action game into something else that became Devil May Cry. Now, likewise, back in 1997, designer Yoshiki Okamoto wanted to make a version of Resident Evil set in Japan's Sengoku era during the 1500s so they could set it in a quote-unquote ninja house full of traps. That project, which was meant for the N64 disk drive, remember that? You shouldn't, eventually transformed into Onimusha. Guys, look, I love Resident Evil, but I am so glad those games did not wind up under that banner. Also, the logo for number 6 looks like a giraffe. The composer of Resident Evil's soundtrack had a plot twist worthy of a Resident Evil game itself. Now, the soundtrack for Resident Evil DualShock version is credited to Mamoru Samuragochi, a man who's been referred to as the Beethoven of Japan because he composes orchestral music despite being completely deaf. Well, as it turns out, not only was Samuragochi super good at hearing, which means he's not at all deaf, but he didn't even compose any of the music himself. It was actually ghostwritten by a man named Takashi Nigaki. You know, that old chestnut. That old, actually, you know what? This is pretty new for me too, so I actually got nothing chestnut. Holy crap. And those are just a few of the things about Resident Evil that you didn't already know. But tell me, what are your favorite Resident Evil facts? What would you add to this list? Let me know in the comments below and give me the best thumbs up in Raccoon City while you're there. Be sure to like and subscribe or else you might miss next week's show when we talk about the story of a young woman who gets transformed into a beach ball by a spiteful witch and the stranded Tom Hanks who falls in love with her in Hal's Moving Castaway. Until next time, keep on digging. Let's open up the old mailbag, shall we? At Lost the Numbers asks, what 90s live-action Nick show do you want brought back? Well, there's only one acceptable answer here, folks, and that is Nick Arcade, complete with their weird made-up games that people could just not seem to beat. I mean, come on! Just grab the damn wizard orbs already, Derek! Do it! At Stargaze asks, have you ever had your naked booty tickled with an ostrich feather by another guy? No, that's actually something I only do with members of my immediate family. At Felix Smiled Bump asks, if you could live in any fictional world, anime/comics/movies, but you are your normal self, where would you like to live in? Well, that's a great question. Look, there's a lot of safe and sneaky answers here, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Final Fantasy 15 because that world seems absolutely bonkers, and I want to take a long road trip eating various kinds of spaghetti while looking like I'm the Serpentor of boy bands. But tell me, what fictional world would you most want to live in? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time!